Everyone's in the right lecture, right?
Yeah.
Alright, awesome. So I know the game is on and everyone's interested in the game, but I'll know that you're watching when everyone goes, and then I'll pick you up. No, I won't actually pick you up. But the first part of this lecture is that strategic refutation rather, is a lost art. When people watch debates, kind of what they want to see and what they expect to see from the top debaters. Oh, welcome. Are you in refutation?
Yeah, Courtney's second year.
Okay, cool. We just started, so you're not late at all.
Oh,
Hey guys, what are y'all doing? Y'all doing flowing?
Refutation.
Brett, oh, there you go.
Don't worry, it's already been interrupted.
Alright, so let's try that one again. Strategic refutation is a lost art in debate. When people watch debates, kind of what they expect to see and what they hope to do is be able to make 20, 30 solid arguments on case, and everyone's like, wow, that's really impressive. And oftentimes you see debaters that do that, and it looks impressive, but they're not really effectively refuting arguments. The other thing is that people take things like going negative for granted. They think that you have 7 minutes to answer the affirmative case and 6 minutes to give a rebuttal when the affirmative only has 4 minutes to answer it. So they don't think about it strategically. They think about it in terms of making as many arguments as possible. And Sam and I are going to explain why kind of that mindset is not the most effective mindset that you can take. To be effective at refutation, it requires an effective use of prep time, not only in the round, but before the tournament as well. The first subpoint under this is that you must equip yourself to have the tools necessary to effectively refute any argument. If you're not preparing and researching before the tournament, you may be really intelligent, but you won't have the knowledge specific to that topic necessary to win rounds. The second point here is that those that are best at refutation are the people that have the best understanding of the topic and have the best research. The third point here is that when you have read enough on the topic, you'll know which of your answers are strategic. You'll also be able to predict how your opponent is going to answer your arguments, because the way that debates play out in the literature is very similar to the way that debates play out in the debate round. While the literature is a bit more expansive, they're a lot less word economical. In essence, they're doing the exact same thing that we're doing. They're making an argument and it's being refuted by another scholar. And the final reason why strategic refutation is a lost art is, to be honest, because people are lazy. They just want to read a bunch of off-case arguments and say that they preclude everything and all of the arguments go away. But if you're doing this, and this is your strategy, then you're really just shooting yourself in the foot. That strategy is a very narrow strategy, it's very shallow, and it avoids actually engaging the substance of arguments and leaves you vulnerable to way too many 1AR outs.
So, we're bringing sexy back, which means we are trying to teach you guys to avoid those kind of positions and engage your opponent's responses. And the most responsive answers require you to engage in what your opponent said, right? A lot of times you'll hear a word and you think that just triggers to pull out a block, right? Which is important to have substance, but you always want to be responsive not only to the argument, but the way that your opponent is applying the argument as well. You'll know your answers are responsive and effective if your opponent can't extend his case without answering them, right? You always want to make sure that before your opponent can make an extension, they have to beat back your argument first. The easiest way to give a rebuttal is just extend your case. Your job when refuting is to ensure that people don't get this luxury, right? You want to make sure that you're making your opponent's life as hard as possible. Never make your opponent's life easier by just relying on things like off cases to preclude argumentations. Like Josh said, you want to have multiple layers of argumentation. With on-case refutation, your job is to destroy the argument on its level of explanation. right? A lot of times opponents will try to extrapolate new meanings from the arguments they're making, and that's because you allow them to do that. If from the beginning you pin them down to defending the way they explained it from the start, then it's going to be a lot harder for them to extrapolate the argument in the next rebuttals. The key to on-case refutation is layered refutation. On the macro level, your speeches should layer offense like off cases, your case, and on case responses. You want to have multiple layers. You know, if you lose one of those layers, then that means you can rely on the next one, right? That means that you need to have multiple outs, right? And on the micro level, your on case refutation should also be layered. You want to have non-uniques, link takeouts, and terms. As much diversity as you can possibly have makes it a lot harder for your opponent to deal with. Let's be honest. Most arguments suck, guys. And you fear the arguments because you hear them, they're read fast, there's a lot of them, and you think that you can't handle that. But if you really break it down and you realize that arguments aren't that great, you're going to be able to crush your opponents. If most arguments suck, then you shouldn't be afraid to engage them. There should never be a time where you just leave an argument be because you think that it's complicated or you don't understand it. Always engage an argument, regardless of whether or not you think that that's something that... Or sorry, that's not a very good way of explaining it. Basically, you need to identify the holes of an argument and exploit them, right? Regardless of if they're not easy to identify from the start.
So the next section is the broader goals of on-case refutation. As Sam mentioned earlier, you want to make the next speech literally impossible. If you're negative, you want to make the 1AR impossible. If you're affirmative, you want to make the 2NR impossible. The way that you do this is by layering your offense, as Sam mentioned. You want to have a significant number of layers. Now the distinction here is not, you don't want to have a ton of arguments, because if your goal is just to make as many arguments as possible, what you're going to find is that trades off depth with the ability to get in, or it trades off breadth with the ability to get in depth in the arguments. And going in depth and having multiple layers and multiple warrants for your arguments is way more important than having 25 arguments that are 30 or that are not even 30, that are like 15 seconds maximum. You should be closing doors before your opponent ever has a chance to walk through them. This means that you shouldn't just settle for preempting the 2AR when you're negative in the 2NR. When you're giving the 1NC, you should be preempting the 1AR. When you're giving the 1AR, you should be preempting the 2NR. When you're affirming and you're reading your affirmative case, you should be preempting the negative. Because you know a lot of times the arguments that that debaters are going to make against your case, and if you're not preempting it, then that means you have to waste valuable time in the 1AR answering those arguments. So you should be thinking ahead and preempting those arguments. There's a formula for being the best at refutation. The formula is technical proficiency plus positional focus. So what that means is that everyone wants to be fast or clear and capable of exercising our arguments in the most precise way possible. Every refutation should start with your head above the flow. When you're giving a speech, your first inclination should not be to dive directly into the arguments and start answering things in the minutia. Instead, kind of like Facebook, you want to give the judge a status update of what is about to happen. You want to give an overview, tell them what's on your mind, so that they can see what you're about to do, and they're kind of on the same roadmap as you are. After you've connected with the judge, this is where you begin to tunnel down into the specific arguments. It means that you'll do things like speed up, you'll use jargon, you'll be precise, you'll cover all of your bases. And finally, you shouldn't be focused once you go down into the flow. You shouldn't stay tunneled down for 5.5 minutes of the 1NR or for 3.5 minutes of the 1AR. It should be you go down into the flow, you do the technical stuff, you cover all your bases, you answer and extend the arguments that you have to, but throughout it, you make sure that you're coming back up and connecting and talking to the judge. I can't tell you how many times there have been rounds where people have been debating, and they've been winning the debate, but they haven't communicated with the judge. It's meaningless if you think that you're winning all of the arguments, but your judge doesn't know what's going on, or you haven't connected with the judge. So the biggest thing with refutation is not only do you need to be precise, be efficient, and make smart, well-layered arguments, you also have to make sure that you're communicating those to the judge. So there is an intangible aspect to refutation as well.
So, the specific objectives of an on-case refutation. Please don't spend your first rebuttal cross-applying your case to their case, because all you're doing every time you say cross-apply X is making their speech that much easier. That isn't diversified argumentation. They already know what your case says, right? So by applying your case to theirs, you're just allowing them to take out two of your arguments with one stone. It's essential that you make diverse argumentation that doesn't rely on assumptions made in your case. Cross-applications are a waste of time. It's fine to weigh and interact your arguments to the 1AC and the 1NC, but never say that arguments in the NC respond to contention 1. You know, my response to contention 2 comes from an argument I make in the NC. You always want to make sure that your arguments are unique. Diversify your argumentation. Avoid making arguments that rest on the same assumption. I've judged so many debate rounds where I've seen an opponent spend 4 minutes in their NR essentially saying the same exact thing, but in 10 different ways, right? And a smart debater will identify when that's happening. They'll find the underlying assumption and take it out, and that's essentially a waste of 4 minutes. So you want to make sure that all of your arguments aren't relying on the same assumption. And on the flip side of that, if you recognize that a lot of the turns your opponents are making do rely on the same assumption, group those terms, right? Recognize when that's happening to save yourself time, because don't let a quantity of arguments be confused with quality of arguments. You need to preempt the grouping of arguments and destroy your opponent's strategy, right? And what this means is, if you have an idea of what your opponent's going to go for in the next speech, or some of the arguments that you're making that you think might be exposed, you need to preempt that strategy. You need to constantly be telling the judge reasons why the arguments you're making close the door on the issue, right? If you know they're going to stand up and try to make a turn on the extension you're making, preempt that turn. Because that way, when they do make the turn, they have to work a lot harder for the judge to buy it now, because there's already ink on the flow for the judge to work with. Attack the case offensively on multiple levels, but don't double turn yourself. A lot of people get really excited and read all the turns that are in front of them, and they don't realize that that might not be the most strategic strategy, right? So you do want to have multiple layers of argumentation, but make sure you're keeping up with the big picture as well. Kind of like what Josh was saying. Generate offense on your opponent's case. The neg case should always be an option for the 2NR, but not a necessity, right? What this means is, if you get good at on-case refutation, you should never have to win your neg case to win the round, right? You should have enough offense being generated on the affirmative side of the flow to where you could entirely kick the NC and still win. That doesn't mean we're encouraging you to do that, right? It's just saying in the worst case scenario, that should always be an option. When you're AF, if you don't generate offense on the 1NC, then you deserve to lose. Do not let the 2NR cherry pick, right? You don't want to allow the 2NR to stand up and just pick the arguments that you didn't cover and make it look like you didn't give a 1AR, right? You need to be generating offense on their side of the flow as well, because the affirmative case, while it is obviously, your best offensive argument, right, you still need to have offense being generated on the NC. Under coverage in the AR does not mean dropping defense, right? In the affirmative rebuttal, you're obviously not going to be allowed, or not going to be able to answer all the responses they're making. But don't drop turns. Don't drop any arguments on the flow that generates offense for them, right? That should always be your priority, because you can always beat back defense, but turns are game over issues. When you're picking which argument you want to go for, it's okay to concede defensive arguments, but it's all about issue selection. If one argument has 2 defensive arguments and a turn against it, and another has 3 defensive arguments, you should almost always extend the argument that has the turn against it, right? So it might look like you're getting beat a lot worse on one argument because there are 4 or 5 defensive arguments, but that is not nearly as important as answering that one turn that could be devastating later in the round.
The next section is called putting the advanced moves on. The first part of this is the framework. When you're refuting the framework, there are a couple of things you need to cover. You can either accept your opponent's interpretation of the debate, or you can challenge their interpretation and use it as a starting point for generating offense. This could be in the form of some things we'll talk about later on in the week, like topicality, theory. If you don't know what those are yet, don't worry about it, they'll be covered, but just remember and keep a side note here that the framework is one level that you can start to generate offense on. One thing you should never do is just ignore the opponent's framework. The reason why arguments are there is because they're meant to make you lose. If you ignore someone's interpretation, you're probably going to lose, because debaters put those arguments there to beat you with. Even if you're conceding the argument, tell the judge why you're conceding the argument and why it's not detrimental to you, so it doesn't look like you just dropped the argument. It looks kind of like you know exactly what's going on. The next thing you want to do is you want to watch for framework spikes. How many of y'all were old enough, or young enough, I guess, to watch Sesame Street growing up? Does anyone remember the Cookie Monster? Or maybe it wasn't the Cookie Monster, but the song, "One of These Things is Not Like the Other"? Everyone? Yeah. That's how spikes are. One of these things in the framework is not like the other. And that's usually how you're going to tell which arguments are there to make you lose. There's going to be some definitions, and then they're going to have some weird arguments about how it means that excludes this, and that, and this, and all of a sudden, every argument that you had intended to make is no longer apparently your ground. You do not want to drop these. If you drop these, then you are probably going to lose. However, if you want to be good at refutation, you have to make sure that you can't get caught up in the framework. What happens a lot of times is debaters realize that the framework is there, they don't want to lose on it, they don't want to drop arguments, so they get top heavy and spend a lot of time there. And then what happens is similar in the demo debate, similar to what happened in the demo debate, you don't have enough time to cover every argument on the case, and you end up dropping important arguments that can be extended and linked into your framework, for example. So you want to make sure that while you need to answer framework arguments, you're doing it in an efficient manner that will help set up offensive arguments for you or help you win the debate.
Next is the value standards debate. So every once in a while, the value is a great place to make arguments, right? I know at this point in debate, you've probably already realized that a lot of debating on the value doesn't happen, and you know, that's fine. But there are times when you can question the values linked to the topic because it's the highest access point the case has to the resolution, right? So if there are those rare scenarios or cases where the value is something ridiculous and you don't think that it's something the resolution is asking us to assess, right, then maybe that's a good thing to point out. People forget that this is values debate. And if you can explain why they have to win the value links to the resolution, or else their app is just an interesting argument, it's an easy way to host people who didn't put thought into their cases. You know, it might not happen often, but recognize when it is. So on the standard, you should never ignore analysis between the value and the value criterion. It's there for a reason. This is what sets up the justification for the standard, right? So whatever small text or amount of text they have after the value and before the standard is something you should probably keep an ear out for and press them on if it sounds a little fishy. The cards they read under their standard are there for a reason. I can't tell you how many times I've personally done this and seen debaters do this, where there's a card under the standard that just kind of reiterates what the standard is, and debaters just think, well, that's not offensive, so who cares, right? That's not going to be a reason why I lose, so I'm not going to spend time on it. But that card is often a justification for why it's a good standard. So ask questions about evidence. Standard justifications have to have warrants, just like any other card does, right? So if it doesn't have a warrant, that might be a good reason not to prefer the standard. As varsity debaters, you are the cream of the crop. If you don't have answers to the major framework cards, then you're doing yourself a disservice. You always need to start there first. But like Josh said, you don't want to get too top heavy. pin down the operation of the standard and sniff out the taint. Right? You want to make sure that you know exactly what the standard, the mechanism the standard is using to weigh arguments, and you want to identify all the justifications for the standard. That way, you can make sure to at least attack everyone in your next rebuttal. The thing is if they have 5 unique warrants for their standard, and you're beating back 3 of them pretty well, and you ignored 2 of them, right? Those are still 2 good warrants and justifications for why their standard might be better than yours, and that could be something that hurts you in the long run. Lots of standards include concepts that sound non-consequentialist, but in reality, the standards are just in-based, right? So if the standard includes the rhetoric of promoting, maximizing, or minimizing something, it's probably consequentialist. Don't allow them to use rhetoric to try to say that their standard is any different than anyone else's, right? You want to ask them, so are we concerned with ends-based impact, right? Regardless of the rhetoric they're using, you can easily pin down a lot of debaters to agreeing that their standard just means, yeah, we're trying to prevent bad things from happening.
The next section is how to debate the standard. You should always indict the criterion as a bad weighing mechanism because of structural flaws. There are a few arguments that you can make to do this. The first one is that you can claim that it is indeterminate. What this means is that their criterion would not yield an outcome if applied to the topic. Basically, this is a stronger version of the argument you'll see that the criterion is too vague. The second argument that you can make against the criterion is that it doesn't have a bright line. Unfortunately, this argument is often massively overused and is usually, well, it is always a terrible answer to ends-based criterions where you're trying to weigh. The reason why it doesn't apply to a standard that weighs the most amount of rights is because it doesn't need a bright line. Any marginal difference between the 2 worlds that are being compared is sufficient for that standard to have been met. However, it can be an excellent answer when the criterion includes a word that itself requires a standard. For example, you may see ethical theories like contractualism or contractarianism. If you're not familiar with those, I can give you like a 30-second explanation for the analogy, but there will be more lectures that cover this stuff later. Contractualism, for example, says that we should look to principles that people would not reasonably reject, right? But then that begs the question of, well, what principles would people not reasonably reject? Which seems like it would require a criterion within a criterion, so it's inception for the framework, basically. And so in that instance, it can make sense to use no bright line arguments because you can say that there's no bright line for when their standard's met since we don't know what the standard actually means. The next argument you can make to indict the standard and to point out structural flaws is that it's circular. What this means is that it uses the conclusion of one of the arguments as its premise, right? So it's like the criterion is protection of rights. Well, why do we want to protect rights? Rights are good, so we should protect rights, right? It just doesn't justify itself, it just creates a circle. The final argument you can make about the structural flaw is that the standard is internally inconsistent with the value. For example, some people say things like justice is giving each their due, which is a means-based argument, but the criterion involves a maximization. If that's the case, you can try and make the argument to sever the criterion's link to the value by explaining how they're internally inconsistent. The next way that you can indict the standard is by saying that it is bad. So the criterion is just an impact. It's the terminal impact of the entire value criterion analysis. Any type of argument that works as an impact term also answers the criterion. Does everyone know what an impact term is? An impact term, just in case to clarify, is you have link terms which say that like if rehabilitation reduces recidivism, right? That's the link. A link term would be rehabilitation actually increases recidivism. The impact would be recidivism, and an impact term would say recidivism's bad, and the impact term would say recidivism's good. It basically just flips the impact. You can do the exact same thing when refuting a criterion. If, for example, their criterion is promotion of democracy or something like that, and their arguments are all about how democracy is good, it encourages freedom, it gives people rights. You could potentially impact turn it by saying that actually democracy is bad. When nations try and transition to democracies, that transitional period creates wars, causes violence, things like that. That's an example. If you're doing that, you're refuting the standard by saying that their criterion is actually bad. One thing you want to be wary of, however, is if you're going to say their criterion is bad, you then don't want to go to the contention and make a bunch of arguments as to why you link into their criterion. Because then you're saying their criterion is bad and you link into it better than they do, which is problematic. So when you're refuting, that's something that you want to think about. It may be strategic. Instances where it's strategic to impact turn the criterion are if you have a long case and, for example, your criterion is mutually exclusive with the other side's criterion. And so an example of that would be following the earlier example. If they read a case about democracy, and you want to say democracy is bad, and then you have another case that has an entirely different standard that's like deontological, for example, and it doesn't have really anything to do with democracy, you could read that case, make a bunch of arguments linking back to your framework, and then you could impact turn their framework. What you're doing, and why it might be strategic to impact turn the framework, is you're basically saying that all of the offense that they have on the case is reasons to vote for you in the contention level, because all of their arguments lead to a bad thing. So it's just something to think about. It's not a strategy that's very common, because it's not a strategy that a lot of people set themselves up to be susceptible for, but if you have the ability to take advantage of it, it can be very strategic at times. And finally, in a case where both criterions are consequentialist, you shouldn't waste your time refuting the standard. You should argue that the consequentialist standard that they read commits them to the view that all consequences are morally relevant, so that any and all consequences or any and all impacts link to the judge's decision calculus. So basically, their criterion is, what you'll see sometimes is people will narrow down the criterion. They'll say like maximization of life, and then they'll make arguments as to why other rights are not important, and that we should only count bodies, right? But that may be bad for you because you may have a utilitarian impact about why putting more people in jail because of the recidivism rate increases the amount of money that taxpayers have to pay or that people have to spend, so it's bad for the state's economy, right? It's a utilitarian harm, but under their artificially limiting criterion that only is concerned about life, it wouldn't apply. So you want to make arguments as to why the judge, if they're reading or they're defending a consequentialist criterion, all of those impacts are relevant to the judge's decision. And from there, you can concede the framework and you can both have, you can have the debate on the utilitarian grounds.
Okay, so the next part is positional takeouts. Make overviews on the contention. These can be crushing because people often just ignore them, right? You want to show flaws in their logic throughout the entire case. This doesn't mean specifically answering the warrants or the impacts of evidence in the contention, but pointing out logistical flaws with either the order of the case, links in the case, any positional takeouts that you can make, because those immediately tell the judge, wow, like something's wrong, right? Those kind of arguments are usually in a judge's mind given more weight. And the reason why it's important is because using overviews that are specific to the flaws of the particular 1AC will encourage the judge, if they're kind of questionable on an issue, to just resort to voting on that, right? And that's why they're important to make. And give an overview on the contention that isolates the terminal impact of the contention. What this means is you want to debate in terms of worst case scenarios, right? Because the ultimate significance of the link chain is the terminal impact, right? So you want to be able to set yourself up to where even if you lose all the links, or even if you're losing the contention, right, you're still isolating the impact of that contention and telling the judge either A, I outweigh that contention because of Z, right? Or B, that contention isn't relevant, that impact isn't relevant because of this argument in the framework, right? So if you're isolating the terminal impact of an argument, that just means at that point you either have to outweigh it or tell the judge why it's not as significant as your opponent is making it. And status reports. Don't read into what they meant to say. Focus on what was actually said or what wasn't said. I know we said this before, and it's not really easy to grasp unless you see it done in practice, but a lot of times debaters will try to argue against arguments that their opponent aren't even making, right? They give them more ground than they had in the first place. You only need to be concerned with exactly how they're applying their argument, right? So make sure you don't give them a lot of leeway on that. Use CX to isolate the components of their arguments. You want to make sure that you know every component of the argument they're making. That way you can identify the weakest one and expose it in your next speech.
I mentioned tunneling down earlier in this lecture about how you want to start off above the flow, communicating, connecting with the judge, and then you want to tunnel down. What tunneling down means is a few things. On empirical examples, you should be making arguments like they're making empirical claims without empirical warrants. You'll see this a lot of times where people speculate as to the possibility of certain things based on historical, they'll bring up facts that they suddenly had come from nowhere to justify or defend their argument. But they won't have evidence to support it. So you want to make sure that you're calling people out on these kind of technical things. Other arguments that you can make on empirical warrants is that the empirical warrant is not generalizable. What that means is the situation that they're describing or that they're using the empirical warrant for could be an outlier. What you'll see a lot of times is because there aren't cases that line up so similarly, is people will use empirical examples from a sort of different time period, or they use empirical examples from a different sort of, for example, on this topic. It's possible that people will read empirical examples about the efficiency of cognitive behavioral therapy, for example. But what you may find is that cognitive behavioral therapy is only a small subset of rehabilitative programs. So if they're saying, well, cognitive behavioral therapy worked, if you can generate some reasons as to why that might be the outlier in this case, not a generalizable conclusion that would prove that all of rehab would work. So that's just something to think about. On the flip side, if people are criticizing rehabilitation because they're saying there were 5,000 people in a rehabilitative program that weren't rehabilitated, you can make the same exact claim that that empirical claim is not generalizable because the studies show that when we generalize the claim, people on average or on balance are rehabilitated more often than not. The next thing that you want to do is impact comparison. This is probably the most important thing that you can do in debate outside of researching and getting prepared. It's kind of my little soapbox here because no one does very good impact comparison. It's not done well on the state's circuit. It's not done well on the national circuit. It's not done well by the top debaters. And that's kind of always been the case. The very top debaters, the top 2, the top 3, have been the ones that a majority of the time have done the best impact comparison. Impact comparison should start in your first rebuttal. You shouldn't be waiting until your last speech to start comparing impacts for the judge. The reason why is if you wait for the last speech, you're not going to let the impact comparison flesh itself out. If you're the negative and you wait till the 2NR to start impact comparison, then you've given the 2AR the ability to refute your arguments, and you have no way of answering those arguments back. However, if you start impact comparison in the 1NR, and the 1AR answers your impact comparison, then you have the ability to predict what kind of arguments they're going to go for in the 2AR, because they can't make new arguments. Impact comparison happens at the margin. What that means is you should be asking yourself, what is the marginal difference between the status quo and the post-link situation? The post-link situation is just, in the status, for example, using this topic, in the status quo, we do not have rehabilitation. That's not true, but I'm giving it as an example. We don't have very much rehabilitation. The link is the affirmative implements rehabilitative programs nationwide. The post-link situation would then be evaluating a world in which rehabilitative programs have been implemented on a nationwide basis. So the impact comparison, and the impact is drawn from the distinction between the world where we didn't have nationwide rehabilitative programs and the world where we did. And from that, you'll get an impact. That impact, what's in between here, is how you do impact comparison. You should never just say that your opponent causes nuclear war and that's bad. You should specifically say that my impact is nuclear war, or their impact is nuclear war, and here's how much worse my impact is than theirs, or vice versa, right? Another important thing that you need to remember, and probably the most important thing ever on impact comparison, is that the size of the link determines the size of the impact. What that means is this. How many of y'all, and maybe none of you, but how many of y'all have ever seen a piece of evidence written by R.J. Rummel that talks about how oppressive governments have killed like hundreds of millions of people and no one? All right, well, there's this piece of evidence, and I'm going to use an example, I'm old, that talks about how oppressive governments, authoritarian governments have killed hundreds of millions of people in cold blood. On a topic that I debated on, people would use this impact, and then they would talk about some small Middle Eastern country that was slowly becoming authoritarian, and they would be like, so that means hundreds of millions of people are going to die. Well, the first problem with this argument is pretty obvious. There aren't hundreds of millions of people in these small countries that are having authoritarian governments, but that didn't really seem to deter people from making the argument anyway. In those instances, the way you explain it is that the size of their link determines the size of their impact. So I'll give you kind of an analogy that I like to use. How many of y'all have seen 300? All right, cool. In 300, when they've got the giant army here with thousands of dudes, the Persians, everyone here. The Greeks, no, the Spartans, sorry, try and trap them by making them have to travel down this short tunnel, right? The short mountain passageway. The reason why they do that is because there's only 300 dudes over here. This is the impact. This is the link. The size of the link prevented 10 million thousand people from bum rushing 300 Spartans, right? They were able to narrow it down so that they could control how many people were coming through. On the flip side, the Spartans had fought in something this big, and this goes away. That's like a 5-minute battle. These dudes are done. These guys go home to their families and have dinner. So, the way that you explain the impact now is if you have a small link, your impact is not going to be as big regardless of how awesome your impact card is, because you won't be able to access it. So you want to be the Persians with the open field fighting 300 Spartans, because that's probably the easiest battle you'll ever fight. When weighing arguments, there are a few standards. They're called standards that you use to weigh and compare arguments. The first one, I really hope I'm not messing up the camera by standing here, but they can still hear me, I'm loud.
It's good.
The first one is magnitude. Magnitude just means how big is the impact. How many people die? How many universes do we explode with our atom bombs? That kind of stuff. The second one is time frame. These aren't, oh, yikes. These aren't in any particular order, by the way. It's just standards. Time frame means how quickly does it occur, right? So it's possible that both of you have the same impact. So it doesn't really make sense to weigh by based on magnitude, because you have the exact same impact. In those cases, you'll use things like time frame to say that while we do have the same impact, my link causes the impact to occur faster. So if you can win that what you're doing solves or fixes the impact before, or well, let's phrase it this way. If you can win that what the affirmative does or the negative does causes a bad impact faster than your impact would be caused, then that's one way that you can weigh and distinguish between your argument. The third weighing standard is probability. And as you probably guessed, that just means what are the odds that something is going to happen. And this is getting into some pretty advanced stuff, so if it goes over your head, don't worry about it. We can explain it later. The way that a lot of people think about this stuff is they're like, magnitude should be evaluated before probability. I think that that's a pretty myopic way of viewing it. Instead, the way that you should assess impacts is magnitude times probability. And this is a really loud piece of chalk. Probability. So, basically what this means is, let's say someone has an impact where it's like there's a 50% chance that 10 people will die. Right? 10 people dying in the scheme of things is not huge in debate terms. The other impact, so this number, that's not a 1, that's a 1. The second impact is there's a 1% chance that 100 people will die. That doesn't need a comma either. Right? 100 people dying is pretty bad. Which of these impacts do you think would probably be the bigger of the impact? You say number 1. Why do you think number 1?
Well, I mean, like, you convert to decimal and multiply.
Yeah, exactly. If you do it strict addition, that's 500. This one's 100. Right? It's hardly ever, if ever, this cut and dry. But if you can picture it in your mind, and you can see kind of how it plays out in the debate, it will help you out, right? People may have huge impacts about the world going down in flames, but the odds of that ever happening seem so astronomically low that if you have some good arguments about why there's a war that's going to break out in the Middle East, it may not go nuclear, but hundreds of thousands of people are probably going to die because there are going to be lots of rockets launched and guns used, then you can probably explain why that impact is not only more immediate, so it's got a better time frame, but based on our magnitude times probability, it means that even if there's a small chance the world goes down in flames, we'll let someone else deal with that 20 years down the road when it still hasn't gone down in flames, and you can stop the hundreds of thousands of people from dying in a war that has a huge probability. Does that make sense? Yeah, what's up?
However, if you're weighing two extinction possibilities where the magnitude is infinity times infinity.
All right, well, I'm of the belief that that argument doesn't make any sense. Because I know it's a pretty popular argument, but I think that it kind of skews. Well, first off, there are people that are way smarter than I am that have statistical explanations of why that argument mathematically doesn't make a lot of sense. And there are some people that have some crazy arguments about aliens and why that argument doesn't make sense. But regardless, I think that in that instance, you just want to explain why that argument doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It seems like if there were if that were true, then and there's an infinite chance of the world ending, then it seems like that would freeze a lot of actions, right? Like, I wouldn't go outside because if I stepped on a butterfly and that caused global warming 30 years down the road, which could cause extinction, right? Like, the way that that works doesn't seem to be consistent with how government makes decisions, how people interact in their daily lives, which is why I think you would be hard-pressed to find anyone making political decisions stand up and say, yeah, we think the risk of extinction is, the impact of extinction is infinity. Also, you can push them, even if you don't have an answer to that argument, You can push them, because it is a very common argument. People make it a lot, people win debates with it a lot. And people are fine voting on the argument. If it's not answered, it's a legitimate argument. It's by far not the worst argument I've heard in debate. So it's something that you should take credibly. The way that you can also deal with it is by explaining, doing impact mitigation and explaining why their impact wouldn't cause extinction. So even if extinction were an infinite impact, it wouldn't cause extinction, so they don't get to do the math like that. Does that make sense?
And I mean, an appeal to logic is always going to outweigh an appeal to math. Like, your judge is not, you know what I mean? Like, you don't, they use a math equation to justify why there's an imp, like, that's extremely bad, right? But you still have all the links to work with in the case to explain why the chance of that happening are slim to none, right? I don't think your judge is going to rely on the math equation to make that decision.
Yeah, I mean, the president's got like tons of nuclear bunkers, he's fine. So at least there'll be like 5 or 10 people on the planet afterwards. But yeah, so that's weighing, that's refutation.
And just actually, well, just by a raise of hands, how many of you every single time you weighed impacts in a debate round said one of these things? Okay, look, we just made you better debaters.
Yeah, if you start using these in the tournament or in your practice rounds, you're gonna, one, make best friends with a lot of judges because it makes judging astronomically easier. It's unbelievable how much easier it is to judge a debate where one person is doing this kind of weighing. Even, honestly, even if you're not doing the best weighing, if you're attempting to, you're making some warranted arguments, you're kind of comparing, interacting arguments, you're already step ahead of 50% of the debaters that debate regularly because they just straight up don't do it. So the better and the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it, and the easier it's going to make for judges to vote for you. So it's not only going to result in wins, but you'd be amazed at how much friendlier people are with speaker points when you're doing this kind of stuff, because a lot of judges don't evaluate, the emphasis is less on your presentation style and more on your argumentation, and if you're doing this kind of weighing, they're going to be really impressed with what you've done. You've made it a lot easier for them, and so they're going to be much more willing to give you better speaks.
And when you get good at it, it takes less than 20 seconds to effectively debate this stuff, so you're taking that amount of time to make all the difference, right? Like, we teach you these things not to know them, but to apply them. So from now on, every time you're weighing impacts, you should be trying to say one of these things, right?
Does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? Does anyone know that Spain or Portugal won?
Spain.
See, that was a trick question. I knew that, but
You weren't supposed to.
no, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Well, thanks for paying attention, guys.
1-0.
Yeah, who scored? Who was it?
And can we turn the camera off?
Look at this crowd.
Don't delete the video.